We are continuing on our forgiveness series. Last week, we began by feeling the weight of forgiveness. Feeling the weight of forgiveness for those who want it so badly. And for those for whom it's so hard to give. In the interaction that we're currently looking at, Peter has come to Jesus. After Jesus has spoken against the old way, as it was understood, a judicial process of exclusion. He's spoken against the Mosaic law, the isolation of it, the exclusion up to death at the hands of the community. Jesus speaks against it, and he says, at the hands of this community, at the hands of my community, it's not the finality of exclusion. It is the pinnacle of love. Seeking inclusion. And Peter, of course, is Peter. Peter is worried about how far this unending love will go when it personally involves Peter, me. Jesus, it involves me. How far do I have to go with this? Peter comes up to Jesus and he says, Lord, it's great to love without end when it's over there. But what about when it's me that's being wronged? Do I have to forgive? Do I have to forgive as many as 7 times? The point behind Peter's question is love has a limit, right? There's a limit to this thing, right? Later, the Apostle Paul, he will clarify to his letter to the church in Corinth, no, love does not have a limit. It keeps no record of wrong, so it doesn't know when you've hit the limit. And love has no end. But Peter doesn't have the New Testament like we do. So Peter doesn't have the advantage of the letters of Paul like we do. And so he doesn't have the answer from Paul, so he has to get it from Jesus. Jesus tells Peter, nope. Not 7 times, but 77 times. Some translations will say 70 times 7. This conversation, whatever translation uses for this conversation between Jesus and Peter, it picks up on another conversation that opens our Bible in Genesis 4. Before we jump there for a moment, we need a quick aside. When the ancient people wrote, we've touched on this, they wrote to understand deeper things, just like we're seeing Matthew write. Matthew's writing to show us deeper things than just the facts. Just the facts, man. Matthew's writing to show us deeper things. They wrote for wisdom. They wrote to understand these deeper things more than just what the eye can observe. John Walton, he's among the top authorities on this in evangelical scholarship, and he describes the ancient world's concern was not factual as much as it was functional. In modern America, we want the facts and nothing read into it. We want pure facts. What happened when? What and when? For the ancient world, it was how and why. The word I believe John Walton uses off the top of my head is form and function. What is the form of something and how is it meant to function? And where do I fit into that? It gives not facts, but purpose and meaning and a depth of value. So, as we consider this, please don't get hung up on Genesis 4 and some literal questions that we may have. That's not the focus for today. I'm not going to read it literally just as much as I'm not going to read literally that Jesus says, you forgive 77 times. And on time number 78, I say, yes, it's done. It's over. I get to lay you out now. No, Jesus isn't being literal with 77. Matthew's not writing everything literal to align with everything else. There's something deeper going on here. Jesus isn't being literal, and we're going to see that in a moment. So in Genesis 4, we'll see how this shows up on the slide. It's small, but we don't need to read this word for word. Basically, what happens is Cain kills Abel. And his punishment is that he will no longer find rest. He will no longer find rest on earth. He'll be forced to wander. But he worries. I'm a wanderer. Everybody's going to try to kill me. They're going to realize that I have fallen out of favor with the divine protection of God. I'm vulnerable. Everybody I encounter is going to try to kill me. And God says, and this is part of the deeper lesson of this chapter in Genesis, God says no. God says you're suffering and being vulnerable in the consequences of what you did is not a free-for-all for anybody else to take advantage of you. Part of the lesson of Cain is that we don't take advantage of people when they're already suffering the consequences of what they've done. We don't see them in the vulnerability and say, I'll jump on it too and get what I want. When we see natural consequences, karma is a popular word for natural consequences. Oh, there, look, karma, reap what you sow, whatever, what goes around comes around, all this different stuff. When we see natural consequences taking place in someone's life, we don't pounce on them. One of the worst perpetrators of preying on people today, if we want to look at modern examples, a perpetrator of modern times has been discussed and fought over by the two major political parties, and it's predatory lending. Payday loans commonly have interest in the interest rates of 300 to 400%. These are loans that often target people when they're at their most vulnerable. A very large portion of these loans target those who are in the working class. And they mess up. They get a DUI. They get a drug charge. Something happens. And they've been able to just barely live on the balance of life and paycheck to paycheck. And suddenly they do. They mess up. And life spins out of control. And a payday loan guy comes in and says, I can give you the loan. The payday loans, very often they attempt to prey upon the last bit of life someone has left. This isn't the way of God. God says, Cain, I'm not going to make your life of no account. Even whatever life you have left, you're sad that you're not getting to do what you love, but you're moving on. Whatever you have left, nobody gets to take that away. God says those who will take your life, they will receive sevenfold consequences of whatever they do to you. If they kill you, they're going to get sevenfold back. The number 7 is used throughout Scripture as a signal of completeness, of wholeness. God is saying that those who will take advantage of the plight of others, in this case, kill off Cain, whatever life he has left, a wandering life. God says that the predators, they will experience a proportionate return of what they give. They receive consequences that complete a return for what they've done. Cain is telling God, others will see my life now as unprotected and worthless, as something that they can easily throw away, take away from me, and they're just going to kill me, and that'll be that. But God assures Cain that even life being lived out under punishment still has value. A completed punishment will be carried out against anyone who kills you, Cain. Cain's life is not worthless. so that it can't be thrown away by someone and nothing happens. The relevant part of the lesson here for what we're looking at in Scripture is that what justly comes back on someone from Cain, if they kill Cain, it has proportion. Cain's punishment has limits. What goes back on someone who kills Cain will also have limits. It'll have an end. It'll be a complete punishment. Complete meaning there's an end to it. What we learn is that just punishment is not limitless. It has boundaries. Cain is no longer to disturb the ground which received his brother's life. The way Scripture speaks of it, his brother's still there in the ground. The life of his brother's in the ground crying out to God. And God says, you don't get to disturb your brother anymore. But Cain's punishment still has limits. He goes and he has a family and he builds a city for his kids, for his kid, and he lives life otherwise. If anybody kills Cain, they too will receive complete punishment for doing so. The idea of complete, again, being that punishment has an end to it. Consequences are not limitless. The consequences will reach an end proportionate to what you did. So Peter picks up the number that reflects the punishment. Peter's point is this with using the number 7. There is a time at which punishment ends. You're saying there's a complete punishment, which means it starts and it ends and it's completed and it's perfectly and wholly met out and it's satisfied. Peter says there's a time at which punishment ends. There's likewise a time that forgiveness ends, right? Surely forgiveness has a limit. Punishment has a limit, and I'm pointing to that. And so I'm over here saying forgiveness has a limit. Well, Jesus goes back to the scripture that Peter's thinking of, and Jesus picks up just a little bit later. Before we encounter the Mosaic law and everything else, there's a law of humanity. And it happens just after this exchange with Cain. And the idea that punishment ends. Genesis fast forwards after the interaction with Cain to a descendant of Cain named Lamech. Lamech makes this declaration. He begins first by declaring, I killed a man who cut me. And he doubles down on his revenge, on the level of vengeance that he will carry out. And he says, I killed a boy. I killed a child who bruised me. Lamech says that if someone took Cain's life, they would meet with a proportional return of consequences. They're going to meet with consequences that are proportional. Lamech claims 77 times the return of consequences upon those who hurt him. In rabbinic literature, this number means limitless. Lamech takes for himself that those who even barely hurt him, a child who bruises him, there will be no proportion to what I will pay back. To Cain's killer, they would have seen an end to the return of consequences. But to anyone who injures Lamech, to anyone who wrongs him, there will be no end to the extent to which Lamech will go to pay them back. Lamech has claimed limitless punishment upon those who wrong him, and that is consequences that fly right past the resolution of a just rebalancing. It disregards proportionate return. Lamech's resolve is to swear to the unleashing of unbridled, no-end punishment. Jesus takes the words of Lamech to respond to how we act with wrongs and forgiveness instead. Jesus tells Peter, there is no more an end or a limit to love's forgiveness than Lamech saw an end to his vengeance. Just as Lamech's punishments cared nothing about just returns, and they flew right past the balancing of justice. Our forgiveness loves forgiveness. They disregard just recompense. It will fly right past the rebalancing. Peter, the forgiveness is like the love from which it comes. There is no end. There is no end to this forgiveness. Ultimately, Christianity is fundamentally about forgiveness. The early church revolved around it. From day one, it was fascinating to people, the radical nature of Christian forgiveness. They could not comprehend it, but they loved it. In fact, for the first 300 years of the church, the most popular scripture that was used for the first 300 years of the church was Jesus saying, forgive your enemies, love your enemies. This was the most popular verse for the church until they chose to join the power of the sword with Constantine. Jesus' direction to love one's enemies, it was the theme of the early church. It was the center of which they revolved around, and loving enemies was held by the early church as the heart of the revolution that God started. Jesus forgives his enemies who nail him to a cross. Paul declares that Jesus' actions then reconciled those who were not at peace with God, while they were still not at peace with God. The Greek word for reconcile that Paul uses, it carries the meaning to make different. So that through God's forgiveness, peace was made between God and those who were not at peace with him, even while they weren't at peace with him. Peace was made between us and God while we still felt no peace. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, one of modern Christianity's favorite theologians, he says it this way, that in the unifying of divine and human into the person of Jesus, in the body of Jesus Christ, God is united with humankind. All humanity has been accepted by God, and the world is reconciled to God. In the body of Jesus Christ, God took on the sin of all the world, and bore it. There is no part of the world, no matter how lost, no matter how godless, that still has not been accepted by God and Jesus and reconciled to God. Paul says this in other ways. While we were still enemies, he reconciled us to him. The love of enemies such as this, it held the church's imagination for the first 300 years because they realized that it was from God's love of his enemies that had reconciled them to God before they knew about it. Before they even realized what was happening, it had already been done. It was such a radical change of mindset that the church was fixated on it. God had come into history to die at the hands of his enemies, to prove I have no enemies. How could the church not be fixated on that? This was a revolution in understanding of God. For me, in my mind, I think about the impoverished family that's living paycheck to paycheck, and then they win the lottery. They win the mega millions when that thing is at a record high. And as they're waiting to cash in their ticket, they still can't help looking at it. This is, do you know what this is worth? And even after they cash in their ticket, I don't have my phone on me, they're taking their phone and their mobile banking app, and they're just pulling out that bank account over and over again because it feels surreal. This can't be real. It's one of those things that just captures your attention. You can't stop looking at it. For thousands of years before Jesus, the God of Jesus was surreal to people. It felt like that God would never be real. That God can't be real. But Jesus comes with truth. Jesus is the bank receipt that shows an unreal balance of God's love. Jesus is the deposit of forgiveness into the bank of humanity. Jesus is the account balance that when he looks at his killers, catching, paid, forgiven, there's plenty of money here. Jesus is the account balance who then goes to his friends who abandoned him at his death. We've talked about this in the past. I can fathom that my enemies want to hurt me. What would be harder for me to forgive is my friends who left me to die. And Jesus goes to them, touching, I got that paid for too. Forgiven. To this day, if you ask a non-Christian what they know about Jesus, his teaching to love enemies still rates as a top response among non-Christians. Don't know if it's so much with the church anymore. You see, it was with great relief that the church adopted Constantine in. They were no longer enemies of the state. They'd adopted the state, but now the church learned when you adopt the state, you adopt the state's enemies. The church had avoided continuing to be fed to lions in the Colosseum. Their children would no longer be fed to lions. Instead, their children would be fed to the meat grinder of Holy Roman war. Up until the marriage of church and state, Christians as a whole, they held on to Christian forgiveness as their central tenet. It was inextricably woven with the cross. Christian forgiveness, though, is not forgetting. You can't simply forget something and also say that you've forgiven it. If I don't remember it, I can't say that there's really been forgiveness. I don't remember it to forgive at this point. Christian forgiveness is not to act as if it's all good and doesn't matter. The cost of forgiveness is that you're dealing with something that matters heavily. And forgiveness is not reconciliation. Next week, we're going to look more at what forgiveness is and is not. For now, we're going to go to a definition of Christian forgiveness. Christian forgiveness is the radical, costly, and transformative renunciation of the cycle of retribution. It is to bring about reconciliation and healing into a broken world by looking at humanity and saying what God came to earth to say. I have no enemies among you. This is impossible for a church married to a state to say. But even without the marriage of a church and state, Christian forgiveness can still sound impossible. But 300 years of the church show that it can be done. Certainly not perfectly, but it's possible to grasp it, even if once in a while it slips outside of our grasp. So often we can think something is impossible until someone shows us that it's not. And then suddenly, once one person does it, more people can do it. Record running of miles has happened over history. You could never go that fast. Someone does it and suddenly other people are doing it. The illusion of impossibility gets broken by someone, and people find out it's possible. Jesus came to break the illusion that such a forgiveness as Christian forgiveness is impossible. 300 years of the church followed him. And to this day, every so often, a prophet or a prophetess rises out of something that seems unforgivable. There is no way forgiveness can happen in Rwanda. There's no way, as I think over the years of my life, that forgiveness can happen in Bosnia. Forgiveness is impossible in these circumstances. But there's a prophet or a prophetess through history that will break our illusion of impossibility. And they will show us the way of forgiveness. We've talked about Christianity being the way. Forgiveness is Christianity. The two words are synonymous. And the way of Christianity is the way of forgiveness. There was a prophet who walked among us not too long ago, until he met a prophet's end and was murdered. It's where most prophets go. In the history of America, I don't know as we've ever had such an apostle of Jesus' love and Jesus' forgiveness. This person was a descendant of slaves who lived in the heart of Jim Crow. This person was a pastor to a church in the middle of suffering, not only from simple segregation, but active attacks by members of the KKK and other racist people. This person was Martin Luther King Jr. In the first year of Pastor King taking the pastorate of his church, in the first year, 14-year-old Emmett Till would be taken by force from his home and lynched under false charges. He would first endure beatings and mutilation before they would finally shoot him and kill him. But his mother, who walked with Martin Luther King Jr. in the civil rights movement, his mother would later say, God spoke to me directly, and God empowered me to forgive my son's killers. A few months after Emmett's death, Rosa Parks would take her famous bus ride. She'd be arrested and found guilty for disorderly conduct. 4 days after her arrest, Pastor King, he would lead his congregation and other African Americans in Montgomery, Alabama, to just stop riding the bus. The problem was black ridership accounted for 70% of the fares for simply choosing to walk rather than take the bus. 90 African Americans, including Pastor King, they were charged and found guilty for disruption of business. In his second year of pastoring, his home would be bombed. Through his time as a pastor and civil rights leader, even while so sick the doctor had advised bed rest, he would preach peace. As the civil rights movement watched their little girls be blown up by bombs, as they endured abuse after abuse, Pastor King continued to refuse the cycle of retribution. He lived out Christian forgiveness. In 1966, this modern apostle of peace, this prophet of love, he delivered the words we're going to close with today. You'll hear the kids come back here in a second and Nate closes in worship, but we're going to close with these words today. Martin Luther King said, agape love is to understand creative, redemptive goodwill for all men. It is an overflowing of love which seeks nothing in return. And when one rises to the level of agape love, he is able to love the person who does the evil deed while hating the deed the person does. And he is able to love those people that he finds even most difficult to like. For he begins to look beneath the surface, and he discovers that that individual who might be brutal to him and who might be prejudiced, that person was taught that way. That person was a child of his culture. At times, his school taught him that way. At times, his church taught him that way. And at times, his family taught him that way. And the thing to do is to change the structure and the evil system. The one who is true to the agape ethic will, Pastor King went on, rise to the point of being able to look into the face of his most violent opponent and say in substance, do to us what you will, and we'll still love you. We will match your capacity to inflict suffering by our capacity to endure suffering. We will meet your physical force with soul force. And do to us what you will, and we will still love you. Throw us in jail, and as difficult as that is, we will still love you. Bomb our homes and threaten our children. And as difficult as it is, we will still love you. Send your hooded perpetrators and violence into our communities at midnight hours and drag us out into some wayside road and beat us, leave us half dead. We'll still love you. And one day, we will win our freedom. But we will not win freedom only for ourselves. We will so appeal to your heart and your conscience that we'll win you in the process. And our victory will be a double victory. Pastor King, he spoke and lived agape love. He spoke and lived agape love and Christian forgiveness more than I've ever had to up to this point in my life. And in those words of Pastor King, that is Christianity. It is demanding and even deadly at times because it's radical. It's so radical that it turned the world upside down 2,000 years ago. And then about 2,000 years ago, there's actually a man named Jason who was charged for being involved in the preaching of the same message I'm sharing with you today. He was charged for the perceived threat to the state and the state's religion that comes with a message of a king who has no enemies. So here I stand, honored to carry the name, Jason, and 2,000 years later, preach to you that there is a ruler over everything. There is a supernatural ruler over all this world, and that is a king who looks at this world and sees no enemies. So as Nate comes up to close us, we can consider that we love all because love loves all. And Jesus tells Peter in this moment that we're looking at right now, we're to forgive all. Because Peter, you and the world will see in just a little while longer that all's been forgiven. You nailed me to a tree and killed me, I forgive. Forgiveness is hard, it's radical, it's dangerous. But through history, there are people who have shown us it's not impossible. You can live in this world and say, I see no enemies. We can be the eyes of God in this world. Thankful for God who looks at me and says, I see no enemy. I look at myself and I see plenty of enemy to myself. I'm my own worst critic. I'm my harshest evaluator. I am an enemy to myself. God looks at me and says, I don't see enemies.